explain a little bit about the findings and recommendations. Sure.
What we try to do is, we're looking at the issues we've had today and the topics we talked about. So right now is the time that you got two opportunities. One in your packet when you enrolled was a finding and recommendation sheet. So if you're more comfortable writing down your findings and a recommendation, then do that. But if you have some ideas right now, this is a good time, and I'll try to capture, what's a finding, Equal Access to Justice Act is an issue. I can write that down, and then we'll come up with a recommendation how to address it. That's an example of what we're trying to do, because it kind of gives me, particularly as a contractor for ITC, what are some of the marching orders I'll have for the next year. But we also challenge other agencies. It could be a challenge for Oregon State or for the Forest Service or tribes. It could be challenges for tribes, or BIA.
Any ideas? Come forward.
One I heard earlier was to make sure we had state representation in the room, or there were questions that came up to make sure we had state representation.
Could you repeat that, please? Could you repeat what she said?
She said a finding would be, or a recommendation would be to provide state representation in discussions like this.
Great.
Who are you?
Larry Mason, retired University of Washington. I'd like to add something to comments that Marshall made, and put that as a recommendation. He's talking about telling the story and collaborating by educating others. When I prepared for the presentation that I made the other day, one of the things I did was I looked through the websites of the Forest Service budget justification. I looked through the websites of the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. And while I saw some mention of tribes as being important, I didn't see mention of any tribal initiatives or any tribal issues and how they would be integrated into these projects and these programs. I would think that would be a simple request, is that there's really no excuse. Collaboration is illegitimate if it doesn't address the issues and concerns of tribes. How can it be that you can have a CFLRP program that doesn't mention the importance of traditional knowledge as part of their considerations, or anchor forests as establishing the infrastructure needed to carry forth the landscape management objectives?
I really found it apparent that tribes need to continue telling their story. And I think that we're trying to do this as part of the IFMAT implementation process. But I think that if we continue telling that story or develop our own story to tell, it would really help out in developing those lines of communication with our partners.
Bill Tripp, yeah, along the lines of IFMAT, I think we need to add a little something there, because that doesn't really address some of the points that led to the development of like the Reserve Treaty Rights Lands Fund and things like that. I mean, it does show the amount of money for responsibility area for public federal, like trust lands versus Forest Service lands or whatnot, but to get more to the cost of what tribes are going to need to be able to work across those boundaries a little bit more. I know some of that's been starting, and hopefully it grows and spreads out to more areas. But I think that with the All Lands approach, all hands, all lands, whatever you want to call it, it's the community of practice is what needs the investment, and then you can you can build for the fire adapted communities concepts into being the bridge between the resilient landscapes and the fire response goals. Because ultimately, I mean, if we could even save, the amount of money you could save from mobilizing crews from one side of the country to respond to another side of the country and have people in place would be huge. So I think some of those kind of economic considerations it might be good if we could build some of those, some numbers behind that. And I mean, I can't say I read it, if Matt, in its entirety, so I couldn't say if it's in there or not, but I did see some good things in it, some summarized. But I didn't notice it, right, emerged right up front, so. I think it would be great to build on some more of those economic factors.
Could you summarize the recommendation? I don't know if I haven't kept the. Could you
Summarize.
recommendation in a short?
So I guess the recommendation would be to build more of the economic factors on what tribes may need to be able to meaningfully engage in this all lands concept at our territorial scales. And invest in our communities of practice to do so.
All right, Ken Borchert, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Northwest Regional Office. Today we heard a lot of good information. We've been hearing it through the entire conference about collaboration, effective partnerships, talking about the issues, creating a vision, looking at the puzzle pieces. I mean, that's real good finding. One thing that I would challenge, though, is going forward in time is the call to action. We need to start doing landscape level projects at appropriate scales across the boundaries, like everybody's saying. But we need it on our other federal ownerships. The tribes are doing a great job. I think they're doing a lot of great management, and we're passing along all this traditional ecological knowledge. It just needs to ramp up now. So we've got the concept in place. What we really need to do is start utilizing the tools in the toolbox. And we heard a lot of stuff today about, you know, adaptive fire management and putting fire on the ground. Well, that's not the only tool in the toolbox. We need to start mechanically harvesting. We need to start putting folks to work, healthy communities, healthy forests, creating not only spatial and diversity and vertical structures in these stands for all of our wildlife and all the traditional uses. So I would just challenge folks that we need to think broader, we need to think bigger, we need to get away from the analysis paralysis. We know it needs to be done. It's time to go. Just get it done.
I was kind of thinking the same kind of way. I mean, what is apparent is that there is a scale that we as individual landowners really can't comprehend, a scale that needs to be treated, you know, in ways that are way beyond, you know, our individual authority, but there needs to be something like at a national scale or some, you know, large national movement to get going, you know, like you were saying.
Yeah, and like we've heard too, 15 years ago, the federal firefighting suppression budget, 15% of the national forest budget. And now 50% of it is, half of all of the funds for the Forest Service go to fire suppression. And that's ridiculous. We should be doing stuff for doing fire prevention, and that means that we need to do some treatments on the ground. And some of the things that were crazy, I worked for a short time on the Fremont-Wainema National Forest, and I just looked at how the land base was being managed, and it was, the treatments that they were doing were good, but timber harvest was 12,000 acres a year. The commercial forest land base there is 1.6 million acres, the commercial land base. And so, are we even putting a dent in it? And then I talked to the forest silviculturist at that time, and I said, what's your return interval in it? She said, 40 years. I said, so 1.6 million acres divided by a 40-year return interval means we've got to be treating 40,000 acres of new treatments every year, in addition to the follow-up treatments that we can use prescribed fire for. But then I did say, you know, we're so far behind, and we're so much of the forest is unhealthy that first 5 years, we need to cut 100,000 acres a year. And the forest supervisors just looked at me and said, you can't do it. And I said, well, with that attitude, you're not gonna do it. And it was just,
fired.
in the areas that they had treated were good, they're healthy, and they look good. But the problem is, it was too small of a scale. And so, we don't have to make every acre all things to all creatures all the time. We have to understand that there's gonna be a diversity and evolution through time of what these stands evolve into and what their utilization's for. So I just ask people to think a little broader, not be quite so meticulous, and everything doesn't have to be just perfect. We need to do a good job and have good vision.
Take off on that, Marshall Pecor, Menominee. I heard Fred Clark today, and I was talking to him at break today, or at dinner, and he said some good things. He was going to do some good things, I thought, and especially back in our country with the Forest Service. And it seems to get things off the ground, yeah, you need something bigger happening on the way down, and that always jars some people. The problem that we got back home with the Forest Service is to talk about bigger, better things, as he was just talking about management. And it's like, you can't have anything to say on this forest because we got this hierarchy. And yeah, you guys might know what you're doing in Indian country, but you really don't have any say here. So I think that's got to get cleared up a little bit. And I think what Fred was talking about today has the start of correcting some of that to the district and levels and that at the Forest Service level. But I don't think the guys are that aware of it. I mean, back home, they're not. Whether it was TFPA or whatever, they're not aware of it. But some of the stuff that Fred was talking about today, research and development, tribal engagement, roundup, or roadmap rather, those are all good things. It gives those guys the tools to interact with us guys when we're talking about something. But I think you need something next to introduce it to everybody. That they may talk about it, they may go forward a little bit with it, but I think there has to be, whether it's a training program or I forgot Jim's, a national meeting where they talked about it and kind of give the marching orders and it trickles down. But I don't think it'll happen unless something like that happens for us back home with the Forest Service. So my suggestion would be some type of follow-up meeting that Fred was talking about the things that he's going to do, but some type of implementation of those things.
I think they respond well if it's directed down,
Yeah.
right? And I
However,
think that maybe directed.
I don't know what to put down, I'm not sure.
Don't you think, I guess what I'm really saying, Jim, is as a follow-up or a introductory type meeting on the roadmap that Fred Clark is proposing for a lot of the relationships that the Forest Service could have with Indian tribes, giving his staff direction. The guys that aren't well informed on that back home.
And my take on that is, that's what our TFPA meetings did. We got people in the same room, and we talked about all the things that happened, and we had more success at those than I've seen in any other meetings.
Okay.
Because it was down at the local level. Because what Jim Hubbard said is, they put in a directive out at his level, then it goes down to the national forest systems for state and private, then it goes down to the regions, and they all got autonomy to interpret it. The national directives in the Forest Service, he said, don't work.
Maybe we're getting lost in the shuffle, or where we're not seeing it back home, though, is because there's so many problems with fire out here, and we don't share that problem. Well, like I said, we got other problems. Maybe that's our disconnect with the Forest Service back there.
And Fred was very, that TFPA, Fred was very emphatic, and so was Brian. Brian says, we need to go to the lake states, do TFPA bring people together, start talking. It's more than TFPA. The TFPA workshop, we talked about a lot of things. And that was getting it to the ground level. And Brian Rice was there, one of the national guys, saying, people, this is good. Because there's so much disconnect within the Forest Service. I mean, just to give a direct they've never worked.
Maybe I'm saying it too soon, and maybe it'll happen, but it hasn't happened to this point.
I think that's what I would put on that, Marshall, and I think that's where if we do a TFP workshop, I think we'll have more luck. Get the right players on the room at the right time and start talking about the issues.
I see it as somehow communicating that tool, I guess, at the ground level. The tool of the roadmap coming out of the OPR, somehow getting that communicated with the country.
Sure.
Well, just to add on that comment, I think what kind of Marshall and some of you are talking about is maybe just some sort of basic U.S. Forest Service personnel competency training on how to work with tribes. Because I'm also a Forest Service employee, and the first week that you join, you have a couple trainings to go through, and one of those easily could be an hour-long session on what actually our trust responsibility is to tribes, and make the point clear that it's every single U.S. Forest Service employee that has that responsibility. So some sort of like basic competency training, and that's what we're trying to do actually in the Office of Tribal Relations and through the Research and Development Roadmap. That's one of the items that we're trying to address. So yeah, basic competency training. Because I get tired of reminding my own Forest Service employees about it, so if everybody knew, that'd be great. The last point I wanted to make, and it does sort of hit back on what Larry and other folks have talked about communication and educating the public and sort of sharing our story. And I kind of sometimes feel like it's not our job anymore. We've really tried hard in Indian country to continue to tell this story. And I think maybe we need to challenge our educational institutions who are training our next, wave of forest managers, environmental scientists, et cetera, to actually start incorporating things like TEK into their curriculum, inviting local tribal personnel to talk to their natural resource classes, et cetera. And to realize too that unfortunately we're losing a lot of our forestry departments. It's sadly almost like a dying field, and it's being replaced by a lot more schools like environmental sciences and more broad general fields, which is fine, but I guess just to realize that, it might not always be a forestry 101 class that people go through, but you might be reaching out to more like environmental science departments too. So challenging our academic institutions to actually, train the next workforce. Yep, okay, thanks.
So, this is, just dawned on me that we had some of this already written into the Western Region Action Plan. So, I know that they aren't per se going word by word for what's in that plan, but the CUISA strategy, Western Region Strategy Committee and WFLIC has recently decided that is going to that still be used as a collaborative guide, a guide that was collaboratively developed, and you could call on actions within that as you see fit in your local areas. And so one thing that is in there that it would be good for folks to pay attention to is what is the overarching objective number 5. We put a lot of work into writing that up, and it had to do with investing to using the most effective combinations of grants, agreements, contracts, and compacts to get things done, but ultimately to be able to pull from all federal sources, which is a lot what you heard today, or this week, is to leverage funds from wherever you can find it. And so to leverage those funds, build your story, on how you're implementing portions of these programs, and then, you know, create a mechanism to be able to, you know, provide testimony, to move, like, use things like this Reserve Treaty Rights Lands Fund to invest in some of those activities and build the capacities in those activities, and then with that being a recurring funding source, then you can compact chunks of that, and then as all these other federal programs that you're implementing with your grants and agreements and other things, then you can try to use the appropriations process to move money from those agencies to backfill that fund. That way you can end up ultimately systematically going through these areas of high priority landscapes across the country and invest in the capacity to be the only logical partner to take the lead with for those agencies. And it was put together very rough, but I think to just take a look at overarching objective number 5 in the Western Region Action Plan, and look at the TEK sections in the Science-Based Risk Report, and try to move forward on those things.
Al Murray, Forest County Potawatomi Forest Manager. We've been talking a lot about working across boundaries, but I think one thing that's always a holdup is understanding authorities, like in the Forest Service system. Maybe a recommendation to provide training on Forest Service authorities, Forest Service contracts, and all of the methods that they have to pass down funding or come into agreement with tribes would be a beneficial training opportunity for tribes. In the long run, without understanding of that could create huge holdups in how you can relate with the Forest Service.
Kelly Hetzler, San Carlos Apache Tribe. My comment has to do with telling the story, which we've talked a lot about, and I would propose that in the past we've talked about marketing and branding of forest products, and perhaps it's time to talk about marketing and branding of forest management. Because on the ground, we're frustrated because we're trying to implement projects and get things done, but at the top they're frustrated because they're not hearing enough of our accomplishments. We're either planning a project or we're doing a project. We're really bad at telling our story of what we've done. And so I think there's a lot of ways that what we're already doing could be shared out better if we had more of a bird's eye view. And, you know, things that we're working with the Forest Service right now in the Coronado National Forest. I never really thought of that as collaboration. I thought of it as sharing crews and employing tribal members, but you can spin that a lot of different ways. And if you want a boring technical report, we're the people to do it. But if you want something colorful, we're not often the best choice. For example, last summer we had the skunk fire, which was a resource benefit fire that was 74,000 acres. That went on for almost 2 months, and in the meantime we had 5 or 6 other fires that we were managing. Writing about those fires was not the top of our list. And I was amazed at the end when we had outside people come in and write a story, it made us look really good. You know, there are people that are a lot more colorful writers than we are. And so I guess what I'm suggesting is that we have more of a bird's eye view and maybe employ actual writers to tell the story versus just resource specialists, whether it's at, you know, regional levels or ITC, because ITC hears a lot of things that are national level buzzwords that, you know, we hear climate change and biomass and okay, I'm cutting and I'm burning. But you guys at the national level would know what it is that's being looked for, and maybe at regional levels it could be summed up and shared. Maybe I don't think my project is relevant, but that bird's eye view sees that 6 or 7 tribes in the region are doing similar sorts of projects, then write about it and share it. We'll get more mileage out of what we're already doing. But we need writers. Good ones.
Larry Mason, University of Western, retired. You know, as you get older, you develop a personal relationship with history. And it becomes somewhat frustrating to see how the rest of the society, especially the younger ones, can drift away from an understanding of things that you know to be fundamentally true because you lived through it. You know, when I personally have been involved with 3 of the 23 collaborative forest landscape restoration projects over the years, in a professional capacity, providing technical support and observing the stakeholders and the, you know, the years and years. And there's one fundamental challenge that they never get beyond, and they don't even really acknowledge, that I think is important for this group to understand, and I think it goes to Kelly's point and Marshall's points as well, about how we think about not only telling the story of what Native people's understandings of the real world are, but integrating that into strategies for the broader public good, for sustainability. The first problem with collaboration is they never come to common agreement about what the problem is. They have different understandings. It gets, again, back to my presentation on Tuesday. Because there's so many buzzwords, they don't have a common understanding of what the problem, what the starting point is. Instead, what they do is they jump forward to develop individual visions or agendas or whatever based upon narrow views and misunderstandings. A lot of it's in the language, like we hear science-based solutions. Science, you know, I mean, you get to, people that don't understand things get to where they're looking for phraseologies that hide the fact that they don't understand things. That sounds like a good idea, you know, because everybody respects science. Science is technical support. Science-supported adaptive management would be a much better objective. To try to hide behind science, like somehow specialists at universities are going to come up with vision, that's silly. But because we don't understand those things, we can't get our arms around the original problem and begin to talk together about how we craft solutions. And what that means is that we have lost common sense. And really, a big part of traditional knowledge, from where the understanding and the education that I've had, is it's common sense supported by keen observation through millennia and trial and error. So it's common sense reinforced with reality. That's the foundation. It's not so much the spiritual aspects, it's just the beginning of problem solving in a fundamental way. And that's, you know, really, I think, getting to what Kelly said, that the Indian story provides an opportunity for the broader society in a politically neutral way to begin to get those understandings of how to approach problem solving.
Very interesting comments. Sarah, one of the things that I would encourage the young folks in the audience here to do is that we need to have all levels of the tribal community involved. And it's not just sort of universities or the Forest Service needs to be more informed. Tribal people need to be informed as well. Too often they seem to take for granted the gifts that their environments provide. And their leadership gets distracted by lots of other emergencies and things. We have to find some way of informing tribal leadership, supporting tribal leadership, preparing them to actually engage in these discussions. It's not going to really happen at the local staff level. If you really want tribal change, tribally driven change, it's got to be driven by tribal leadership. And in order to do that, we have to begin to educate and inform tribal leadership, give them the support that they're going to need to be able to participate effectively and to be able to influence the development of policies, programs, and those kinds of things. We've heard a lot about sort of communication and tell your story, but I think that what seems to be missing here is the need to have an outreach strategy. That too often we seem to rely upon the old models of, we'll write a publication and we'll put it in a journal somewhere and it'll somehow magically influence public thought. But that's not where public thought is being formed these days. It's being influenced in ways that we never imagined a few years ago. You know, social media and those kinds of things. We have to find a way of beginning to message in a way that's going to inform, inspire, and motivate folks so that they can understand really what's at stake for them. Why are healthy forests important to them? Is it water? Is it clean air? Is it the soils? It's probably all these things. But we haven't done a good job of conveying that message. It's not how good a job we're doing on a particular project or not. I think that's the story that needs to be told. To me, the story needs to be told is, why is it important that we care for the land? Why is it important that we care for the forest? Why do we have to harvest timber? Why do we have to do thinning? Why do we have to do all of the other things that we have to do to care for the land?
And I would add, don't forget the grade school curriculum.
Yeah. I think that comment was basically, don't forget the grade school curriculum. As I indicated,
Jim Harris should get into Facebook school.
we have to find that way to engage the entire community. Because we're in this for the long run. It's not that we can change things overnight. But what we can do is to begin to change the culture and the priorities and the perceptions of risks and values. I think that's where the real game is going to lie.
I just want to echo what Gary said there, because when you look at our other workshop over here doing workforce development, we don't even educate our own peoples to want to be forester or natural resource manager. We're running out. We don't have the pipeline of young people. And back at Caldwell where I live, they all want to stay on the reservation, but they want to be in some kind of technical job. They want to invent games or do something that's all about, you know, the now, here and now, what's the present. But the best jobs, and everybody you talk to in forestry says that's the best job they ever had. You know, they really are passionate. The biologists are passionate. The hydrologists are passionate. The soil scientists. But we don't find our replacements. And that's part of that communication and telling that story. It solves two problems. One is understanding, but the other one is recruitment. And that's a big challenge we're facing. You're soft-spoken. You're not loud like me.
Just on comment on what Gary was saying, the way we're doing it at Menominee, we recognized that problem quite a few years ago. We got a tribal college. We also got a part of the tribal college, a Sustainable Development Institute. And I recognized all my years there that I didn't do as good of a job as the guys that were teachers. Once I taught the teacher about some of the things that were as important about forestry, he did a much better job in conveying it to the biology high school class at the tribal high school or the elementary school. So what they've been doing, and it's still growing, is the tribal college is working as a catalyst to get out the message of forestry to the elementary and high school schools. But again, it's a tough road because they got limited time and available. But I thought it was a good approach. Then they bring in professional staff or the tribal forestry staff as speakers or demonstrations out in the field. That seems to go really well as far as telling the story. And they write articles about forestry and historical events and all the rest of it about forestry. So again, but it's just in its second year or so. It seems to be working already.